All right. Good morning, and thank you, Paul, for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. As Jennifer already mentioned, we've been quite busy at the Commission in the last couple of weeks. There's this little thing that happened on May 6th. So I was a little bit worried about getting enough time to put my thoughts on this paper together, but as luck should have it, it's not the first time I see it. I have been one of the economists working on the ABS rulemaking at the Commission. So I've seen this paper about a year and a half ago, probably a very early version of the paper. And the question is, well, why did it make our reading list? Oops. There. So the main question that this paper addresses is, what is the optimal risk retention scheme in a securitization? And when we talk about optimal here, what we really mean is optimal for screening incentives. And as Ingo pointed out, they've discussed three alternative mechanisms for risk retention. There's the vertical slice, in which the originator will retain an equal proportion of each tranche. There's going to be the equity tranche risk retention, which is the most junior tranche in the securitization, or the mezzanine tranche, which falls kind of in between the senior and the equity tranche. I'm not going to go through the details of the model. We've already seen that, but I just wanted to give you some intuition as to what are the tensions that make this model work. Well, the larger the portion of the portfolio that is securitized, in other words, the less risk that is being retained, then the lower the incentive to screen. Of course, this is kind of intuitively obvious. And the part that might not be intuitively obvious, but Ingo talked about, is also the higher the payoff to the originator, because there's this private benefit from securitizing rather than holding the loans in your portfolio on the balance sheet. And also, the more screening effort is exerted, of course, the better the quality of the loans being extended, so the higher the payoff to investors, but at the same time, the more cost is being incurred in this screening effort. So we have the model, we have the setup. We saw Ingo go through the conclusions. But the main answer to this question of what is the optimal risk retention scheme, as he pointed out, is, well, it depends, okay? Which is not something that regulators like to hear. It depends. What does it depend on? It depends on a number of factors. Most notably, how bad would the bad state of the world be, along with how thick is the tranche that you're retaining, or the slice, if it's a vertical slice. Because if the bad state of the world is bad enough to wipe off all of the equity tranche, then holding the equity tranche, as we heard, really does not create any incentive to screen. So it could result in zero screening effort. We can go through kind of the exact same motions and come to the same conclusion with the mezzanine tranche. There is a state of the world, or that is expected with certain probability, where there will be zero effort exerted in screening. So what I want to point out in this setup is that the vertical slice type risk retention does result in some screening all the time, except that it's never the optimal level of screening the way it is defined in the paper. And this will come up in a later slide, but what do we mean by optimal level of screening? Well, Ingo argues that that should be the level of screening I exert if I decide to hold the loans on my portfolio and not securitize at all. Okay? So let me start off by saying, very interesting paper. We've enjoyed reading it, and it certainly has informed our thinking in working on the ABS rulemaking. So my comments will be more along the lines of questions as to, well, how do regulators actually use this paper? How do we use the conclusions? So the first thing I'd like to know is, well, can this model be expanded to include agency problems post-contracting? So maybe the ex-ante information problems are not the issue. We know that monitoring can affect the value of the assets held in the pool, and by extension, the value of the asset-backed securities. There could be some wealth transfers that siphon value from senior tranches down the waterfall. What do I mean here? Well, there have been allegations that some sponsors, rather than close out push loans into foreclosure, troubled loans, have modified them instead. which would benefit those holding the bottom equity tranche, but not the senior debt holders, which would have gotten the cash from the foreclosure of those loans. So how do we deal with those kind of issues? And once we consider these post-contracting agency problems, would then a single risk retention scheme emerge as a dominant solution? Our thinking at the Commission was that, well, a vertical slice would possibly solve these kind of problems, because this is the only case in which we have the incentives of the sponsors be perfectly aligned with those of the investors in all tranches. But we'd like to see some work on that. So that would be definitely a paper we'll add to that reading list. What else? Well, my main issue with the paper really is that we read it and we're really not sure what to do. So is it possible to resolve some of this ambiguity? And it depends. For instance, could there be some classes of securities for which a particular risk retention mechanism is optimal? And my thinking here is, well, maybe we look at prime residential mortgage-backed versus subprime RMBS. For subprime RMBS, I'm thinking, well, the probability of a bad state of the world occurring is maybe higher. So that might resolve some of this ambiguity. Also, how about coming up with an optimal mechanism for certain securitization structures? So the paper considers a tranche-type securitization. How about pass-throughs? Do we avoid some of these problems? Would that be the optimal securitization design in the sense? Can we prescribe a particular risk retention mechanism that's optimal in that scenario? And then I had this crazy idea. So the first time I read the paper, as I said, 1.5 years ago, all of the talk out there was, well, equity risk retention is the best way to go. And I took the paper to say, well, not quite. There are other ways that might be dominant. Now, my second reading of the paper was a little bit different. I thought, well, maybe what the authors are trying to tell us is that equity tranche risk retention is not such a bad idea if we should mandate the thickness of that equity tranche. And I'd love to hear what you think about that. So maybe set up an equity tranche the size of which is risk-based. So I say risk-based capital requirements here. I'm thinking with my banking hat on. But that's kind of what I have in mind. And then require sponsors or originators to hold that whole equity tranche. That was my crazy idea. And I just wanted to point out how complicated this issue really is. So deciding on the scheme to use is just part of it. It's just the tip of the iceberg. We have to decide, well, what's the optimal level of risk retention? 5% has been thrown out there as the magic number, but really we have no good analysis supporting one number or another. Some have said, well, 5 is really too little. 10 or 15 is more like the right number. Others have said, well, 5 will stifle securitization, really, so 2 is what you should be looking at. But somehow 5 has emerged as the consensus, and I don't know why. I'd love to know why. It's the wrong number. 5.5? A round number. 10 sounds even more round than that. Just thinking out loud. Which should be the entity retaining the risk? So in the paper, it is the originator. In the current SEC proposal, it is the sponsor. And we tried to be practical about this. That's how the sponsor level risk retention came about, because there are a lot of originators, much smaller number of sponsors. A lot of the loan originators are not publicly traded entities. They're not registered companies, not under the jurisdiction of the SEC, so we cannot do much about them. We have a lot more power over sponsors. But on the other hand, of course, there are conflicts of interest between different parties along the securitization chain. So what's optimal from the originator's perspective in terms of screening incentives? Is it also optimal for the sponsor? Would like to know. And finally, we have this one-size-fits-all problem. Of course, if we're going to pass a rule, we'd like to pass a single rule. But maybe that's not feasible. And probably that's what the paper is trying to tell us. We have tried to be sensitive to this issue. So in the SEC proposal currently on the table, We have a different type of risk retention for RMBS, CMBS, and the like compared to credit card master trusts. So the revolving nature of those assets makes it very difficult to have a vertical slice type risk retention. We've tried to accommodate that. But we try to accommodate other asset classes in different ways. And also, I already mentioned the issue of different securitization structures. And now, how about the value of disclosure? I didn't quite see that in the paper, though we saw it in the presentation. But it seems to me that the screening problem is ultimately an asymmetric information problem. So can we require enough disclosure ex ante to reduce, maybe not eliminate, but to significantly reduce the need for this kind of screening? And along the same lines, it's kind of a more general question, and it's come up in several talks that we've seen yesterday and today. Should we really view the screening effort exerted under no securitization as the first best and socially optimal solution? Arguably, it's best for investors. They get the better assets and the better cash flows, from better returns from those assets. But admittedly, some of the benefit from securitization is derived from the ability to extend credit to riskier borrowers. So maybe we don't want as much screening, yes, I said it, as much screening as what the non-securitization scenario would prescribe. In other words, do we really have trouble with having low-quality assets being securitized if their low quality is known and consequently priced? So I got my...
But if you don't screen, how do you know? How are you going to price the low quality?
You can produce information. You don't have to keep them out of the market. That's all I'm saying.
But this is really for a given price, who do I get?
Right.
Right. So it is a pricing question. It's not an extent question. I can always price it for different securities. It's just within the price I choose screening for the ones that fit the criteria.
Fair enough. So I thought it's a well-written paper. I definitely enjoyed reading it. And it shows, I forgot to mention this, but Ingo pointed it out, that there seems to be need for regulators here because no optimal risk retention scheme would naturally arise in this marketplace. But at the same time, it does highlight how difficult it is for regulators to come up with an optimal risk retention mechanism that's being mandated. So that's all I have. And I think there are questions.
Ingo, would you care to respond before questions, or do you just want to...
I'll go back, yeah. Respond. Well, I like the discussion partially because we've been struggling with exactly those questions in writing the paper. We would have liked to, do I need this? I don't think so. We would have liked to come up with clearer answers, but it's actually very difficult to get there, partially because I think in the end there is no right answer, and retention may not be the right mechanism. I think that's the uber finding of our paper, because I agree with the arguments on the vertical slice. It helps you fix, and we actually mentioned this in the paper, it helps you fix something that we see as a second order problem, namely the alignment of incentives across tranches rather than alignment of the screening incentives to maintain the quality of the overall pool, which is what we've been focusing on. If you want to get into the second, then the vertical slice has certain attractions, but it's still, you'll be facing the question of right-sizing the amount. And here I'm coming back to something that I highlighted in the presentation, and it's not fully highlighted in the paper, I guess. And this is the point of nominal tranche size not being the right metric to fix retention requirements. You need something risk-adjusted. And then that then raises all sorts of risk measurement related questions, model questions, and so on. And that's not something that regulators would typically want to get into if they can avoid it. It's also something that relates to your proposal of, what was it, risk-based capital plus equity tranche retention. So there are all sorts of very specific issues there that you would have to address. And I think that's my reaction. Thanks.
Well, my take on this is that revealed preference says investors don't want to do the stuff you guys are talking about making them do. And so that's make us a little bit worried. And so why bother? And your basic premise is that securitization is bad and causes this crisis, which probably isn't true either.
No, it's not. That's not our premise. It's quite the
Well, I
contrary.
mean, what's wrong with securitization? What's wrong with them doing whatever the heck they want to do?
Well, first of all, our premise is not that securitization is a bad thing.
Okay, so why
Quite
do
the
you wanna
contrary. We
change?
believe that securitization is a very good tool to do a lot of interesting things. I mean, basically, the key way of thinking about this is that it helps you to enlarge the capital base that can be devoted to lending, which socially is something that
But
you really
my point
want.
is that if they weren't already doing it, why do you want to try to make them do it, particularly
I
stocks, you know?
I think what I want to add to what Ingo just said is we do believe securitization is good. No securitization or very little is happening right now. So how do we fix that? How do we bring that market back? There's some, what we would say, market failures, especially along the lines of disclosure, that we think we can fix in a way that will help revive the market.
It worries me that you think you can fix something.
Okay, I will try that.
Well, providing more information is not, if you think about providing more information, that's not going to do any harm, right? It may help fix the market, so it's certainly something you want to
So
pursue.
maybe part of the problem is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are out there, and everybody, there's sort of some issue of they're having all kinds of advantages and less mover advantages, and so it's not surprising.
Now, you're focusing too much on mortgages. Securitization is broader than just mortgages, and the market is dead beyond mortgages. Partially because there's a lot of extension going on, like what you just did in the investor community, extending structural flaws that have been primarily affecting the subprime mortgage market in the US across all segments of securitization. And all this business that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, more information, less complexity on all this, may help to address that very issue.
Yeah, well, it seems to me like part of the problem is also that there's obviously lots of uncertainty right now as to what regulations might actually come into place and how those regulations are going to apply to securitizations that are going to be issued now. So until there's clarity from the regulator, we expect the market to be completely dead. And that's what we have.
Yes.
I'd like to add a huge social benefit to securitization in addition to your slide. One of the great benefits of securitization, if done right, it can connect borrowers directly with lenders without having a highly leveraged financial intermediary in between. And as Ed very eloquently points out on page 3 of his paper, almost every financial crisis is the product of overly aggressive leveraged risk-taking. If we take the leveraged intermediary out, we reduce systemic risk to a large degree. So there's a huge social benefit to getting securitization right, and I want to encourage you on your efforts here.
I agree on the latter point, and certainly we'll be pushing on with those efforts. But somebody has to do the maturity transformation, right? And this is where leverage comes in.
Yeah.
Part of the problem that the market is facing at the moment, that a huge chunk of the investor base, SIVs and similar vehicles, work on the basis of leverage. So part of the solution might be to get those guys, probably not exactly those guys, but somebody who does something very similar in a safer way back into the market on the investor side of things. Because most of the securitizations out there don't do maturity transformation.
And I would be cautious to view capital markets as substitute for bank lending, really. There are a lot of benefits that come from bank lending, which I think it's hard to replicate in capital markets broadly.
We have time for one more.
Both Ingo and Seth mentioned that this retention could be not observable, so why don't we just disclose anything and the market can price them correctly? So what do you think are the reasons that why originators don't provide enough disclosure to the market, or why, in this case, if they have retained something, why don't they have incentive to disclose their retention in the first place?
Or why don't they choose to do this on their own? You gotta give me a reason why they wouldn't do this if it's actually optimal.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but when you look at how securitization markets worked before the crisis, you'd be amazed about the lack of information that was there. And still investors bought into the stuff, and that's something that makes the market vulnerable, right? And the leverage problem that we are currently facing is something that needs to be addressed. I think that's my answer. I don't know whether it's an answer to your question. But
Then you're saying, in reality, investors are not behaving in the way you model them, in the sense that they are this through everything and